welcome to the Team Legacy Invaders YouTube channel. This is Benji, and we're going to be talking about my favorite archetype in Yu-Gi-Oh!, and that is the Infernoid Archetype. The Infernoid Archetype are a collection of Fire-type Fiend monsters who can be summoned from the hand or graveyard by banishing other Infernoid monsters you have in your hand or your graveyard. So there are actually three different types of Infernoid monsters. You have the normal summon, Infernoid Decadron. There are 10 inherent summon monsters, so monsters that can be summoned that do not involve an effect, kind of like Blackluster Soldier. And then we have one monster from their extra deck, which is their fusion monster, Infernoid Piatti. And we're going to discuss them in order. So let's start with Decadron. Infernoid Decadron is a level 1 tuner. Now, I'm going to read his effect out loud, and I'm going to explain the parts of it as I go, because he's got a hell of an effect. If this card is normal or special summoned, you can send one Infernoid monster from your deck to the graveyard except Infernoid Decadron, and if you do, increase this card's level by the level of the sent monster. So that means if you send a level 4 monster, his level will become level 5, because it will increase from 1 by 4. And you can do this for any of the Infernoid monsters, whose levels range from 1 to 10, so you can make this monster anywhere from level 1 to level 11. You can send no monster, he'll be level 1. You can send a Nuku, the level 10, he'll be level 11. So, alright, so that's the level part. And the next part says, and if you do that, this card's name becomes that monster's, and replace this effect with that monster's original effects. So, if you send a Nuku to level 10, he'll become level 11. His name will now read Infernoid Nuku, and his effect will say what Nuku says, which is when this card is special summon, destroy all monsters on the field other than itself, and so on. And that's a permanent change. So if he should be negated afterwards, after this effect is resolved, that is what this card says, because that's not an effect that's continuous. It's a trigger effect that has successfully resolved. So you cannot negate his effect and then make him suddenly become a level 1 tuner and Decatron again. Which is very important for playing live Yu-Gi-Oh! When you have to explain this to other people. Additionally, if he has an effect of one of the Infernoids that you can tribute himself to get him off the field for whatever reason, you can do that. Now, because he's a tuner, the level in which you send of the monster in your deck gives you a lot of control. You can choose specific spot removal effects based on the other Infernoids, which we'll talk about in a minute. So you can do monster destruction, spinning of set cards, or destruction of spells and trap cards. You can give him the battle effect monsters, or the monster negation effects, or the spell or trap negation effects. Additionally, because you can choose his level, you can make very specific choices to make specific synchro monsters or specific Xyz monsters. So let's talk about the other monsters, because if we don't know what they do, we actually can't see the full power of Infernoid Decadron. Alright, so now we're going to talk about the inherent summon monsters, of which there are 3 different tiers, and we're going to talk about all 3 tiers individually. But before that, all 3 tiers of inherent special summons have one thing in common. They cannot be normal summoned or set, and they must be special summoned from your hand or graveyard, depending on the tier that they're from, by banishing some number of Infernoid monsters from your hand or your graveyard, while the total level of effect, total level or end rank of all effect monsters you control are 8 or less, and they cannot be summoned in other ways, even though there is a card that summons them ignoring their summoning conditions. So, if you control effect monsters of 9 and above, you cannot summon an Infernoid, but if you control 8 or less, you can summon an Infernoid when it comes to effect monsters. Now, some of the ways in which we get around that are by playing non-effect monsters or normal monsters. So normal monsters allow you to play additional monsters even when your levels are too high, because they don't count. So certain monsters like Scrap Archfiend or Gemini Pearl can be used to get around the effect level limit. Also Gemini monsters like Synthonian Emperor Dragon, which is one I was testing for a while. Also, it works particularly well with the Psyframe engine, because Psyframe Driver is a level 6 normal monster, and the Psyframe monsters cannot be normal summoned or set, so they work well with a support card, Reasoning, which we'll talk about later on. So, the 3 different types of Infernoid monsters are the level 1 to 4, this is the first tier. They are the babies. Then we have the 5 to 8, which are kind of the Deme Bosses, and then the levels 9 and 10, which are the boss monsters of the deck. So first we're going to talk about the babies. So the baby tier are levels 1 through 4, and they can only be special summoned from your hand by banishing one Infernoid monster from either your hand or your graveyard. And they have the same effect that applies only on your opponent's turn. The effect that applies on your opponent's turn is that you can tribute one monster you control, not necessarily itself, to target one card in your opponent's graveyard and then banish it. So all of these monsters can be used to disrupt your opponent on their turn. Additionally, each one of them has their own spot removal effect that applies on your turn. So we're going to take a look at that now. So the first one is Infernoid Piatti. He's level 1, he has 0 attack and defense. His effect is you can target one set card on the field, that's either player's side of the field, and shuffle that card into the deck, and that card cannot be activated in response to the activation of this card. So it's kind of like Night Beam, so if people do want to play around it, they can by activating a second card as Chainlink 2, and then the selected card is Chainlink 3. But mostly these cards that get targeted are things like Solemns and so on, so they can't necessarily get around it that way, but it is possible. So if you hit a Twin Twister, perhaps they'll activate a Breakthrough Skill and then chain Twin Twister or something. Although I guess if it was Breakthrough Skill, why would they bother? Now, he's level 1, so if you send him to the graveyard with Infernoid Decadron, you can increase Decadron's level to level 2. Now, some of these babies actually cannot attack the turn they use their effect, but because Piatti has no attack points, I guess they decided not to print that on him, so if you do make Decadron into Infernoid Piatti, you can swing for 500 damage. Alright, let's take a look at the next Infernoid. Next up, we have Infernoid Antra, who's level 2, which means if you send him to the graveyard with Decadron, Decadron will be level 3. His effect reads, you can target one face-up card on your opponent's side of the field and return it to the hand. So he's particularly good at dealing with your opponent's extra deck monsters by not destroying them, but by sending them back to the extra deck. He has 0 attack and 2000 defense, so he's pretty good at just putting out there and making it hard for your opponent to get through to you. Now, I assume they've made it so you can only return face-up cards they control to avoid doing some crazy loops, which there's no point in really thinking about at the moment because we can't target our own cards, so it's irrelevant. Like, returning a Decatron to your hand would be pretty cool, but we can't do that. Alright, so let's take a look at the next Infernoid monster. Next we have the level 3 Infernoid monster, Harmadic, who has 1600 attack and 0 defense, so if you send this to the graveyard with Decatron, you'll be level 4. Now, his effect is you can target one monster on the field and destroy it. The turn you use this effect, you cannot attack. So, in this case, Decatron would not be able to attack. He could if you used Piatti or Antra. That's pretty much it for this monster. He's very good. He was one of the more expensive monsters because he was an ultra rare, but he's been reprinted since, so that's not really a problem. Let's take a look at the next one. So now we're going to take a look at Infernoid Patrulla, who's level 4. He has 1800 attack and 0 defense, and once per turn you can target a spell or trap card on the field and destroy it, and if you use this effect you cannot attack. So he's similar to Harmadic. He's a little bit stronger, he's got a higher level, and he deals with back row. Now this could be useful on your own cards, because there are cards in the Infernoid Archetype in which you'd want to destroy. I guess the same could be said for Harmadic. There are monsters on your field you may want to destroy for your level effects and so on. They're also the most used for Xyz and Synchros, so we'll talk about those combos in another video. Let's take a look at the Deme Bosses now. So the next tier of Infernoids are the Deme Bosses, levels 5 through 8. Now, they all have the same summoning requirement, which is that you can summon them either from your hand or your graveyard, which is unlike the babies, who can only be summoned from your hand, by banishing 2 Infernoids from your hand or graveyard. That includes both at the same time, so you can do one from your hand and one from your graveyard. They all share one common effect, and that is, during either player's turn, you contribute one monster you control, not necessarily itself, to target one card in your opponent's graveyard and banish that card. So it gives you a bit of control with your levels. Now, all of the Deme Bosses have an effect that involves battle of some sort, so we're going to take a look at those individually right now. First up is actually one of my personal favorite Infernoids that not a lot of people play, and that's Infernoid Piatti, the level 5 with 2200 attack and 0 defense. His effect reads, if this card inflicts battle damage while attacking an opponent's monster, you can take one card from their hand and send it to the graveyard. So it's not necessarily a discard, so it doesn't activate the effects of like a Dark World monster or anything like that. But if you don't have a way to kill your opponent, his effect is particularly useful to maintain card advantage. Alright, so let's take a look at the level 6. Infernoid Sajet has become very popular recently with the release of Void Feast, one of the support cards, which we'll talk about later on. He arguably has the worst effect of all of the Deme Bosses. He can be summoned once again by banishing 2 Infernoids. He has 2400 attack and 0 defense. When this card declares an attack, your opponent has to banish. You can trigger this effect, which is your opponent banishes one card from the extra deck. Now it's their choice, so it's a particularly weird effect. They just select the thing that's least useful. Something I discovered, which is pretty cool, is that if your opponent triggers a replay in the battle phase when he's declaring an attack, he can redeclare an attack and force them to banish a second card from their extra deck. Now he's particularly useful because a level 7 Decadron, which is what you need him for, is good for making certain rank 7 plays, which are part of OTKs, which I'll address in another video. But I actually like this card a lot. I played both the level 5 and 6 for a couple of years now for a lot of synchro OTK plays, which we'll discuss later on. So let's take a look at what's arguably the best Infernoid monster now, the level 7. Alright, so Infernoid Sitesmoss, who's level 7, has 2600 attack and 0 defense. His effect is a strange one. If this card battles a monster, at the end of the battle phase, you can banish one card of the field. So this is a non-targeted effect. It does require you to battle. It does not necessarily require you to destroy a monster. So attacking a defense position monster will give you the requirement to activate its effect. Now, the problem with it is it activates at the end of the battle phase. So if your opponent allows you to attack with this and then forces you to tribute it off to banish a card, or if they destroy it, you won't actually be able to resolve its effect. Also, if it needs to attack either a monster that's smaller than it, so that could be a problem. Other things that I've tried to work with that effect are cards that keep him from dying in battle, like Safe Zone was, I think, one of my original ideas. It needed to run over a Dark Destroyer, so I would attack directly into Dark Destroyer, take 400 damage, and then banish it. So it has its uses. Additionally, there are some rank 7 OTKs, which playing this card makes particularly helpful. So let's take a look at the last Deme Boss, the level 8. The last Deme Boss of the Infernoid Archetype is Infernoid Attendel, level 8 with 2800 attack and 0 defense. He's partially like Blackluster Soldier, Envoy of the Beginning. You can, if this card destroys a monster in battle and sends it to the graveyard, you can attack again in a row. So there are a couple exceptions to this effect. A Pendulum monster, when it's destroyed by battle with the Attendel, will actually go to the extra deck, so it won't go to the graveyard, so you won't be able to attack again. One that occurred a while back was when Monarchs were popular. Destroying the Prime Monarch and sending it to the graveyard did not trigger the effect because it would check what was destroyed in the graveyard, and it was a trap card, not a monster card, so you actually couldn't activate this effect to attack again in that scenario. Now, I play a particular OTK that uses a Attendel, along with Utopia Beyond, so I like to have at least one copy in my deck. Although making Decadron a level 9 monster is not particularly useful because that will level lock you. So let's take a look at the big boss monsters of the Infernoid deck. Alright, so there is the third type of Infernoid inherent summon monster, and that is the 3 banish monsters, the level 9 and 10. We'll talk about them in a moment. They both require you to banish 3 Infernoid monsters from your hand or your graveyard, and you can summon them from your hand or your graveyard, just like the Deme Bosses. They have on-summon effects, and they also have, they don't have the banishing effect that the other cards do, they actually have effect negation, so let's talk about them individually. Infernoid Piatti is the first of the boss monsters. It is level 9, it has 2900 attack and 2900 defense, unlike all the other Infernoids which either had 0 attack or 0 defense. When this card is special summoned, you can destroy all spell and trap cards on the field except for void cards, which are the Infernoid Archetype support. So that's what got me into the deck, is that I can destroy my opponent's cards and not mine. But then you actually have to play them, and most people don't play them. It has a second effect, just like all the other ones. You can tribute a monster on the field, not necessarily itself, once per turn during either player's turn, to negate the activation of a monster effect and banish that monster. So this is one of the more popular ones to use with Decadron, just to set up some form of disruption on your opponent's turn. Although making a Decadron level 10 by sending a level 9 will lock you up pretty hard, so you have to decide how you want to use that. So let's take a look at the last monster in the inherent summon set. Alright, so the last Infernoid monster in the main deck is the level 10 Infernoid Nuku. His effect is that when he's summoned, you can destroy all monsters on the field other than himself. So unlike Piatti, who doesn't destroy void spells and traps, Nuku does still destroy all of your Infernoid monsters. He has another effect which is similar to Piatti. During either player's turn, once per turn, you can tribute one monster you control, not necessarily himself, to negate the activation or the effect of a spell or trap card and banish that card. So Lately, there's been some cards that you haven't been able to stop with things like Totally Awesome, because they only negate activations. But things like Cyber Dragon Infinity can actually negate the effect of a card. So a Nuku can negate activations or effects, so he gets around to quite a few more cards than you'd expect. So yeah, that wraps up all of the Infernoid monsters in the main deck. Let's just talk about the last one, Infernoid Tiara, the fusion monster. So Infernoid Tiara is a level 11 fusion monster, whose fusion materials are Infernoid Nuku, Infernoid Piatti, and one or more Infernoid monsters. And when this card is fusion summoned, you can apply these effects in sequence depending on the number of fusion materials with different names used for this card's summon. So it has 4 effects. If you use 3, which is the bare minimum you can use, which his effects are optional. It says each player send 3 cards from their extra deck to the graveyard. So I personally send 3 copies of Cyframe Lord Omega at the moment because we are still waiting on the release of Elder Antonina Tess. Omega has a graveyard effect, which is to return itself to the extra deck and target any card in either player's graveyard and return that to the deck. So you can actually use it to mess with your opponent's graveyard, even if you can't tribute a monster to banish a card in the graveyard at the time. Elder Antonina Tess says when this card is sent to the graveyard, destroy 1 card on the field. So when that card comes out, I'm sure people will be playing a combination of Omegas and Elder Antonina Tess to use with this effect. The next effect of Tiara, if you use 5 or more, which is very easy to use with the fusion spell, which we're not going to discuss in this video, but the fusion spell lets you fuse from your deck, so it's actually much easier to summon than it looks like. If you use 5 or more, both players send 3 cards from top of the deck to the graveyard, which, depending on the deck you're playing against, you may or may not want to actually activate his effect in that case. Because if you're playing things like Burning Abyss, their cards activate when they're sent to the graveyard, or Shadal's, so it's a concern to actually activate that effect. One way around that is to not use 5 different names, but to send duplicate copies of the same cards. So maybe send all 3 Decatrons, a Nuku, and a Piatti, and you've only used 3 different Infernoids. The 8 monster effect, which doesn't happen particularly often, is that each player returns up to 3 of their banished cards to the graveyard. Well, and since your opponent you can return anything that's spells or traps or monsters, and a lot of decks have cards that activate in the graveyard, so that's also dangerous to use. And the 10 or more monster effect, and there are only 11 Infernoids in the main deck to fuse, so you actually do have to run at least one of the 2 that people don't like in order to use this effect, which is both players discard their entire hand, which is particularly good for Infernoid players because you can just set all your cards, then when you do the fusion summon, if you have to discard a monster, it's still useful in the graveyard, so you just make your opponent lose a particularly large amount of cards. So that's going to wrap up the discussion of what the Infernoid monsters are. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the Void spells and trap cards, and then we'll take a look at additional support cards, and then we will look at combos and other things you can do with them. I'll see you guys next time. And if you like what you saw, you can find one of our latest uploads right here. Also, YouTube has recommended this video for you. Click here to make sure you subscribe to our channel to get updates as soon as they occur. See you next time.